I just want to kick us off. My name is Tolga. I am the CEO of PARC, and I just wanted to welcome you all to PARC and PARC Forum. We have a super exciting event here tonight, and thanks for joining us. It's great to see a good mix of past and current employees and colleagues and friends from everywhere, and it's great. We're very happy to have you here, join us, discuss our rich, almost 50-year-old history here at PARC with some extremely distinguished guests in Leslie, Chuck, and Eric. They have lived through decades of Silicon Valley, and of course, Chuck and Eric are a big part of the DNA of PARC, and we're really lucky to have had and to continue to have some of the most brilliant minds in their respective academic fields to continue to invent the future. And as I thought about sort of introducing the event tonight, I realized there was just sort of one thing that remained constant in a world that's not so constant, that's ever changing, and that's the fact that we kept our eyes always on the future here at PARC. And of course, back then, 40 years ago, it was about inventing the office of the future, and you're going to hear a lot about that from the panel. But we continue to do that today. Keeping our eyes on the future in a very, very different world, in a world of AI, in a world of machine learning, in a world of IoT and autonomous transportation and digital manufacturing and many more domains. So it's exciting and welcome again and enjoy the panel. I'm really looking forward to the conversation as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie.
Thank you all very much for joining us, and to everyone who's here on the live stream, that is exciting as well. So the way that this is going to work is sort of a three-part operation. So for the first part, Chuck and I are going to be talking about Futures Day, which is a day that happened 40 years ago this month when PARC had the opportunity to go to a Xerox corporate big event, a couple hundred Xerox execs, and tell them what they thought the future was going to consist of. Chuck was one of the people who was in charge of that Futures Day event, and he actually has shared some photographs and some videos that I don't think most people in this room will have seen before. Unless you were at Futures Day. It just occurred to me. Who here was at Futures Day? Okay, there we go. All right, so fantastic. So that will be part one, Chuck and I talking. Part two, Eric Schmidt is going to take that third seat there, and he is going to join us to talk about PARC's impact in the Valley and beyond. And then after that, we're going to take questions. I understand that we're doing this a little differently than how most forums work. So please note that questions are going to be taken via email. The email address is here, forum@parc.com. And that we'll take questions up until about 5:40, at which point they'll be being aggregated. We'll keep talking, and then we'll switch to Q&A. So that is the plan. I wanted to set the stage before the two of us start talking, sort of what was the idea behind Xerox PARC itself. And I wanted to read to you from, actually, my book, which...
Are they available for sale?
They are indeed. And actually, for those of you in the audience who had just raised your hands, or people who I've talked to or interviewed for the book, I will be signing books after, but I also have this copy that has a big green, excuse me for hitting my mic, This is my copy of the book, and I did this with my first book, which was a biography of Bob Noyce, and asked people who were in the book or part of this history to sign it. So I'll have this up front, and I'm hoping that I'll have the good fortune of having other signatures. Chuck has signed, Eric has signed, Larry Tesler, Roy Levin. It's been Al Alcorn. The book isn't just about PARC, so that would be great. So let me read to you about PARC's birth. In 1970, Xerox's chief scientist, Jack Goldman, convinced the company to launch a research facility supported by a $6 million annual operating budget and staffed with, I know, the best in computer scientists, electrical engineers, systems analysts, operations researchers, mathematicians and statisticians, and biophysicists and biochemists. The goal was nothing less than the invention of the Xerox of the future. So this is as early as 1970, with a focus on the architecture of information. The original name of the research center, possibly rejected for its unfortunate acronym, was the Xerox Advanced Scientific and Systems Laboratory. Chief Scientist Goldman proposed that Xerox locate the research center in a university town with an intellectual nightlife that would attract and benefit researchers. Within the center, he envisioned 3 laboratories to target basic science, systems science, and computer science. He also had a few specific ideas for future products that might emerge from the labs. A machine which is half xerographic printer and half computing machine, for example. But the essence of his plan could be distilled to 7 words: hire great researchers and leave them alone. He told Xerox's top management to expect nothing useful from PARC for at least 5 years. But it didn't take 5 years, did it, Chuck?
Sort of.
Kind of. So that sort of sets the scene for us. And I wanted to ask you, Chuck, when did you first come to PARC?
Well, I came to PARC in 1972. And the way I got here was I began my career as a math professor in Cleveland at John Carroll University and working on my PhD in math at Case Western Reserve. And Nan and I got married and started to raise a family. And we had a faculty meeting in the math department to discuss the graduate students and how they were doing. And unfortunately, one of the students was clearly not going to be able to finish. And so we decided he had to be told. We drew straws, and guess who got the short straw? So I'd never done anything like that before. I didn't have any training in doing it or anything. So I just said, well, I guess I'll talk to him the way I'd want him to talk to me if our roles were reversed. So I did that. He left, very disappointed. But a year later, he called me. He said he wanted to come see me. And I said, fine, although I wondered when I hung up the phone what his year had been like. And he came into my office, big grin on his face. He said, Mr. Geschke, the best thing you ever did is kick me out of here. I got a job selling computers for General Electric, and I made so much money this year, I just had to come and thank you. I was not making much money as a professor. At any rate, he said, but you know, I've been trying to think how I could really show you how grateful I am. And it occurred to me, would you like to learn how to program a computer? I said, sure. So nights and weekends, he came by and taught me to program in Fortran. And that was my first introduction to computing. My undergraduate degree was in Latin, which didn't necessarily help with the programming, but it was a good thing to have it in my quiver. At any rate, Nan noticed I was having a lot more fun fiddling with that computer than a very esoteric topic for my thesis at Case. And she said, you know, Chuck, if that's what you like doing, you really ought to do it. You know, follow your instincts. I said, well, I'd have to go back to school. I said, no, we don't have any money. We already had 2 children. How would we do it? She said, don't worry about that. It's more important that you follow your dream, and we'll figure it out. I married very well. So I went down to Carnegie Mellon and asked them if I could get in. And they looked at my background and they said, Latin major, that's a little unusual. He said, but you aced the GRE. And I said, well, I've been teaching it for 5 years at college. He said, oh, okay. Well, he said, we like to have people from different backgrounds. This was Alan Perlis, who's a wonderful man. And so I got a scholarship, an ARPA scholarship, which was enough to live off of and pay all of my bills. And there were no taxes to pay on that, like I'll have to in the future. So when I was getting close to finishing, two of my very good friends, Ed McCrite and Jim Mitchell, had already left CMU with their degrees, and they came out here and got a job at PARC. And they said, you've got to come and talk to PARC. So we arranged to come out to California. Nan had never been in California before, and so she immediately fell in love with the climate and everything else about it. And I was lucky enough to get a job offer, and they said, as soon as you finish your thesis, come out to work. And so I came here in October of 1972.
Interesting. And was it your first job in a company? Had you been strictly in universities the whole time?
Right.
Huh, interesting. And did it feel like a university research type environment?
Well, you know, there were so many people from the ARPA community here, mostly because Bob Taylor and Jerry Okind, who were responsible for recruiting, were part of the ARPA community, and they knew where we all were. And so it just felt like I was back at CMU.
Yeah, and ARPA, I'm sure 99% of the audience knows, but ARPA is now called DARPA. It was the Advanced Research Projects Administration out of the Department of Defense, and sort of an unknown by people who think that Silicon Valley started, you know, in 2000, important source of so much money and so many of the ideas that have come to fruition in so many areas. And so when did you hear about Futures Day?
Well, I got an invitation to go to lunch with John Ellenby and Tim Mott. And I could tell as soon as we sat down that he was going to ask me to do something. John was pretty open about that kind of thing. And at any rate, he described to me what George Paik and he had talked about, and that Xerox was going to have this big meeting of about 300 to 400 senior managers from Xerox all over the world. It was going to be in Boca Raton, Florida. And they were willing to give PARC the last day, and they were going to call it Futures Day, and we had an opportunity to show them what we had been doing to try and develop the Office of the Future. And obviously, this was a big prize for PARC to be able to be seen in that environment, and so of course we said yes, and began the whole process. John was the overall leader of the activity. I was responsible for all the logistics, getting all the computers, the printers. And by the way, personal computers in those days were quite large and very heavy. So it wasn't easy to move all that stuff around. In fact, we had to lease time on 2 DC-10s to get the equipment moved for the entire project. But we began working on it, and it was an activity that consumed a lot of the resources of PARC. There were about 100 employees at PARC and down in El Segundo that worked on the project. And the number of people that actually went to Boca Raton and stayed there for like 2 weeks numbered it in the high 40s. So we really, in some sense, moved PARC to Boca Raton, Florida. And the way we decided to do it was that in the morning of the Futures Day, we would put on a big stage show. There was a big auditorium in the hotel and had a huge stage on it. And we would do in effect, a show with people running alto computers, describing what they were doing, and making it possible for the audience to see the capabilities of what we had built. And then in the afternoon, we would do what today you would do at a trade show. We put in a hands-on environment, a whole bunch of altos, network together with printers, and people could come in and go through the exhibit, sit down and use an alto. They could ask questions and so forth. So that was the sort of overall plan. And we had over 20 altos that we shipped to Boca Raton and for the event, and 6 printers. 3 of them, I think, must have weighed a ton each. The Dover printers were 60-page a minute black and white. The Pimlico printers were 10-page a minute full color. And then there was a couple other kinds of smaller printers that we have.
And you actually gave some photos and such to be shown here.
Right.
So explain why there are pictures from Hollywood.
Well, we decided that to put on a huge show like this, first of all, we needed to rehearse a lot. Secondly, we had to build a set. And thirdly, we needed some advice about how to do something like this and make it exciting and vibrant for the audience for on the order of 2 hours and keep them engaged. So we did a deal with a production company down in Los Angeles. We rented a big sound stage on one of the movie lots. We moved in a bunch of altos and printers, and then we began building the set. And what you're seeing here is that the set, and you'll see a second picture in a moment, consisted of 4 cubicle views of offices. Each had an alto in it and an individual who was going to operate the alto. And in addition to that, there was a huge screen, which could either be used to do video of the person who was working in the alcove or show the screen of the alto so that people could see in detail what was going on. And we spent, I think, about 3 weeks in Hollywood putting that all together until we had it ready to ship. And so I think we can move on. There's another picture here now of what happened when we got to Boca Raton.
And I just had one quick question for you.
Oh, sure.
How did you, what gave you the idea to do that? What were were you inspired by Engelbart's Mother of All Demos? Had you seen demos that you wanted to imitate? I mean, what were your models?
To be honest, at that time, no. I'd never seen, I don't think Allenby had necessarily either. I mean, we all knew about the work at SRI and, you know, and that amazing demo that was done and talked about hypertext links and all those things. But no, we really didn't have a role model for what to do. Steve Jobs wasn't around yet to show us what you could really do on the stage. And so, no, it was our invention.
Yeah, this is one of the themes actually that I kept coming across in my research for the book, is just that people just made it up as you went along. You just sort of hoped it would work, and it seems like that's still a big part of startup culture. So here you go, you guys have arrived.
All right, that's John Allenby in the front and Mike Overton. And by the way, I meant to do this at the beginning. If I forget a name or mess it up, I apologize. The disk drive doesn't turn as fast as it used to. And I also apologize to the women who were in Boca Raton, because I know you by maiden name, not your married name. And I'll have to use the maiden name because otherwise I'll get horribly confused. So anyway, that was us coming into the building. The area they're walking through there is where the walk-around demo was going to happen. It was really a series of meeting rooms that had folding walls between them. And we shipped in a whole bunch of the altos. Let's go to the next one. All right. And of course, we got to get them all up and working. Personal computers weren't quite as reliable in those days. And when you moved them, things moved inside them sometimes. And so there was a lot to do to make sure everything was working. So when we turned all those computers on and a few of the laser printers, now this air conditioning in this hotel was great, but it was designed for a meeting like this or a social event. It wasn't designed to have all that hardware generating all that heat. And so the temperature inside got close to 100. And the Altos were not going to survive that. So what to do? And I think this was Allenby's idea, and it was a great idea. He said, you know, when we land at Fort Lauderdale, they drive a truck up to the plane and stick a big hose up into the plane and turn the truck on, and it generates air conditioning and keeps the plane cool, and they don't have to run the motors. I said, I think we could get one of those. So he called up the airport at Fort Lauderdale, and he sweet-talked them into letting us have one of their trucks. A couple of people went up to get it, and then they came into another problem. Those trucks were only on the tarmacs at the airport. They didn't have license plates. So we got a hold of the state police, the Florida State Police, and they built a phalanx of police cars and brought it down the interstate for 40 miles from the Fort Lauderdale airport and into the Boca Raton Hotel. When we got there, and I think we have a picture of the truck, that's what the truck looked like. It was not a small truck, and the air conditioning equipment and all that is in the back side of it. But now we had to connect it to the hotel, and we couldn't get into the air conditioning system, but we found a window that we were able to pull out. Unfortunately, there was a tree in front of the window. So we got an axe and we cut down the tree. You got to do what you got to do. We didn't tell the hotel about that right away. And I don't think they missed the tree, so it wasn't so bad. And then we have a picture of Richard Bach getting the hose in through the window, and we had our air conditioning and everything was fine.
A big hose. And so I want to have you guys picture what it's like. All this chaos is going on behind the scenes. And if you, maybe chaos isn't fair. All of this innovation is
Definitely
going on
fair.
behind the scenes. And you have, and really if you need anything to show you how unusual this entire effort was, and these stories would suffice. But meanwhile, this is what the execs pulling up are seeing. And they aren't just pulling up, they've been flown first-class tickets, they are in luxury cars, they are being wined and dined every night. The wives have special fashion shows. Henry Kissinger is the featured speaker talking about the USSR, and it's this real contrast because on the one hand it's this very, very fancy event with live orchestras and champagne, and on the other hand, during the day, the heads of Xerox are standing up and saying we are in dire, dire straits. The Japanese copier companies were starting to encroach on Xerox's business. They had to write off Scientific Data Systems. That purchase was a huge purchase and really didn't work out very well. Their stock had dropped from $179 5 years before to $50 on the day that this event opened. And so at night you had the champagne, and during the day you had these sort of dire statements from the leadership. We absolutely can't hire another person. Everything is frozen. And then the idea was in part, but it's going to get better. These guys are going to come and show you the office of the future. So on the last day of the conference, as Chuck said, this big demo starts. And What we're about to see is a few minutes from the video that the executives themselves saw when the lights went down. And something that I hope you'll notice, in addition to, I mean, it's just wonderful 70s vintage everything, is you're going to notice how difficult it is for the narrator, who is someone reading a script that's been developed by PARC, to talk about the fact that paper might be going away. And this is because Xerox, in part, made a good deal of their profits from paper. And so there was a real concern that their own research center was going to cause problems. So here's the click.
Here is our future, the modern office, our opportunity, because it is not very modern at all. Beneath the chrome and coordinated colors lurk huge problems. For this office is little changed in generations. A collection of office equipment, the work often dull and repetitive, and where no machine can talk to another machine. In a word, there is no system. Technology has been used to improve the individual machines, not create a system. And the prime symptom of the problem is the medium, dare we say it, by which most information is transmitted and stored. The villain, can we face the truth, is, yes, paper. Oh, paper has its uses and always will. But today's office misuses paper, especially for transmission and storage of information. Paper has to be handled by hand. Paper doesn't always get the right priorities. It gets lost, and it piles up. How it piles up. Indeed, we are frequently blamed for the paper explosion. The shape of tomorrow is keenly evident if we will but look, and if we do not, others will. The office of tomorrow must use technology to extend our skills, lessen drudgery, speed up the communications process. To do this, it must be a system in which electronics will do what it does best. Paper will no longer be misused. Information will be created in a window, disseminated electronically, untouched by hands, filed without paper, retrieved as well. A paperless office? Not at all. But paper will have a new value. Paper will have significance, emphasis. Will the customer accept a radical new system? Well, the electronic image is no stranger to the young, as natural as paper in an earlier time. Sociologists tell us the games children play are very important. The games fit them for life as they will live it in an adult world, as they are beginning to live it now. Young people are telling us something. Are we listening? They're ready for the future now. Are we?
So that is what they saw, and then the demo started. And so, Chuck, what did they actually see?
Well, the first thing they saw there was keyboards. I don't believe anybody who watched that movie knew how to type. And they certainly didn't have a typewriter in their office. Their secretary did, but they didn't. So what did we show? Well, we were really centered around the Alto itself and a number of different applications. Just the fact that they were seeing a computer screen with fonts, typefaces on it, and a bitmap display that could display essentially any graphic element that you chose to draw on the machine was a big change from anything they had seen in terms of computers. They were mostly just text terminals of one kind or another. Probably the most ambitious thing we showed them was Bravo, which was our code name for Microsoft Word. And in fact, the young researcher here, Charles Simoni, who built Word and with help from Tom Malloy and Butler Lamson, when he left Xerox PARC, went to Microsoft and built Office for them. So Charles has done very well. So Brava was up there, a program called SIL that Chuck Thacker, who was the electrical engineer who did the Alto, was very excited about because it let him do circuit board layouts on the screen interactively. And there was a related program called Icarus that worked with micro circuit patterns on the screen. There was a program called Telesil that actually a graduate student, Sten Andler, who worked for me in the summer of '77 did. And it was the first example we had been able to do of showing multiple altos all looking at the same document over the network, and each alto able to edit independently. And they used the phone for conveying the verbal part of the activity.
This is 1977. I mean, I can't express to you if you watch, because they did a backup of what the demo would be in case the demo failed. So as part of this video, you can actually see what they were doing. And even today, I mean, it is astonishing to watch. And I want to be mindful of the time. So, I mean, it was just, it was incredible. You had the altos, you had printers, it was all connected through Ethernet and to the ARPANET. Was it connected to the ARPANET
Yes.
as well? I mean, it was just insane. 1977, file server, it took decade and the efforts of many companies to actually bring the rest of us to where PARC was in 1977.
So let's jump ahead to the walkthrough part. First of all 300 to 400 executives, I believe, were male. But it was partly a social event, so they were invited to bring their wives. If they were not married and didn't have a wife, they could not bring a girlfriend. Xerox was very paternal about that kind of stuff. So at any rate, they started to walk through, and they could sit down and work with the Bravo editor and a variety of, in fact, all the programs we talked about, they would have a chance to use. This was the body language of every Xerox executive. You don't have to have studied sales to know this is not good body language. And the reason they were like this is they were scared to death. Because like I said, one of them commented, I said, I didn't know a man could type that fast. Somehow it was a female talent, I guess. So that was that, but the wives all had worked in office, or most of them had, and they loved it. They sat down, they played with the mouse, they typed some stuff up, it came on the screen, they hit the print button, they looked at the printout, they looked at the screen, and it was the same. They said, this is amazing, this is great. They were the ultimate customers, and the problem was the delivery personnel were scared to death of dealing with this.
And it wasn't just Xerox. I mean, if you read the literature of the time, I read a marketing report, and it said, managers regard a keyboard as something that doesn't suit their status. So, I mean, this was a widespread bias.
Yeah. So, what did we learn?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, the result of this is that it legitimized the research that was happening here at PARC to an extent that it never had been shown before to that large community of the Xerox staff. And so that was a great thing for PARC. It was a great thing for the Computer Science and Systems Sciences Lab. It really legitimized what we were doing. For Xerox, they actually got a product out of it. The Star Workstation was begun development. A few people left PARC, and a whole bunch of other people were hired and started to work on building a workstation. And they were doing that actually across the street. And it was difficult for them to get the price low enough that Xerox could really make an impact. And so 5 years later, when the IBM PC came out and Apple's machines started to get more distribution, that product, the Star Workstation, really never took off, which is very unfortunate. For me personally, and for all of us who worked on the project, we came home to lots of congratulations from the rest of the staff here, and people were really happy. I got called into my manager's office, Bob Spinrad, and he told me he wanted me to start a new laboratory called the Imaging Sciences Laboratory, and the idea is that we would focus on graphics and printing. Now, I'm a programming languages, systems programming kind of guy. I knew about graphics, but I was certainly no expert in it. So I had to go out and hire a chief scientist. And I'd known a guy named John Warnock by reputation, but he and I had never actually met. So I called him up. I said, let's go to lunch. We went to lunch. We hit it off. Best lunch deal I ever did. And John came to work for Xerox. About a year after, right at the beginning of the, ISL didn't start for a couple years. It started in 1980, I believe. And we almost immediately got a phone call from the people who were working on the Star Workstation saying that they had a problem. And the problem was they didn't know how to get the workstation to talk to the printers. And Xerox couldn't bring out a product that didn't print. Okay, that's what Xerox did. So could you help? So John and I got 3 other people, Butler Lamson, Brian Reed from Stanford. Butler was an employee of PARC, but he was living in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, because his wife was a doctor and she got her first placement there. And a fellow from El Segundo called Jerry Mendelson. And the 5 of us never actually physically met until the project was done. But we used the Ethernet and email and telephones, and we designed a language called Interpress. It wasn't the same as PostScript, but it had the same idea behind it, and some of the same ideas behind it. And we showed it to Xerox, and they loved it. They said, this is going to be the Xerox standard for electronic printing. And so John and I felt pretty good. Boy, we'd only been working there for a year or so on this project, and we've got it as a corporate standard. So I immediately got on a plane, and I flew out to the headquarters in New Jersey. Connecticut, thank you. Stanford, thanks for helping. Stanford, Connecticut, and I said, I need a marketing budget to get out and talk about this. And they said, whoa, wait a minute. At Xerox, we never talk about our technology until a product is ready to ship. I said, well, this is a protocol that's going to require a lot of people to support it, both with Xerox equipment and non-Xerox equipment. Sorry, that's the way it is. I said, well, all right, how long is it going to take the product to get out? They said, well, typically at Xerox, it takes 7 years to get the product out. I said, my God, you're going into an industry where that's at least 3 generations. I said, somebody will do something that may or may not be as good, but they'll have 100% market share when we get ready to go out, and it's going to be hard to get anything. Sorry, that's the way it is. A very depressing flight home, a very depressing conversation with my buddy John Warnock, and that's what made us decide to leave and start Adobe.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it just speaks to how new all of this was. I mean, the notion, you were understanding things, but the rest of the world took a long time to understand how quickly all of this would change. And so now I'm going to ask Eric to come up, and Eric, I'm going to ask you to take my seat, and I will sit in the green seat. And great, thank you. And then we can now move on, because we were just talking about the impact of Futures Day. I just thought it'd be interesting to talk more generally about PARC's impact. But just quickly, Eric, catch us up on how you came to PARC.
Well, a great day for me was when Jim Morris came by Berkeley. I was a first-year graduate student looking for summer students. And I interviewed with him, and all of a sudden I show up at PARC in 1977 in that summer, in that fateful summer.
Wow. And for both of you, I would be curious to know, what opportunities did you get from PARC that you don't imagine having gotten other ways or in other places? What did you carry with you?
For me, opportunities at PARC, my whole career. I mean, it's very hard if you weren't there at the time to understand. People don't appreciate they're making history until after they've made it. And the culture, which Chuck, of course, has both defined and set, was basically of engineers trying to solve interesting problems. But they were the best ones, the best scientists. And so when I showed up, I thought, oh my God, here I am. I'm all of 22, by the way. And I'm with the most senior, best computer scientists in the entire world. They were impossibly old. They were in their, early 30s.
For me, obviously, it led a path to starting a company that has had a much bigger impact than either John or I ever expected it to have. We did have an early failure, though. We tried to hire Eric, and he said no.
I went on to work with my friend Bill Joy at Sun. When you think about today, what did you do today? Everyone here used the internet. Everybody here printed things out, right? Laser printing. Everybody here used some form of the Windows icon menus and pull-down interface. Most of you used a mouse in some form or another. I can just go on and on. And it's sort of traditional to be critical of that era, but I'm not aware of a team of that level of impact. Because remember, some of those people influenced things that happened at Apple, right? Those of you who are users, you know the history. It certainly affected what was happening at Sun. Many architectural things are things that we still use at Google and Alphabet.
The Ethernet, Bob Metcalf, you know, what would have happened if that hadn't happened? Well, the internet really wouldn't have never come to pass, because there wouldn't have been a way to communicate. If you just use phone lines, you're never going to get enough bandwidth.
People forget that there was a battle between the telcos at the time and the internet people. We had different names for ourselves. But they used a standard called ATM, which is not the one that you use today. Had a completely different model. And so the development by Paul Barron of routing, and then the early adoption of NCP, which was done PARC, and then the conversion to TCP/IP, and off we go.
So Bob Metcalf worked with Dave Boggs and Ed Taft.
Who's here?
I saw him up there. And we had built a clone of a PDP-10 because we weren't allowed, because Xerox owned Scientific Data Systems. They wouldn't let us buy an piece of equipment from DEC.
By the way, just think about this. So the government at the time won't allow them to buy something, so they build their own. Imagine what it takes to build your own PDP-10. That's how good these people were.
And we built it in about a year. But it had the Ethernet on it. It was hooked up to a laser printer. And initially it was hooked up to a Xerox graphics printer. And Warren Titleman, who loved to print things, would put up such a huge print queue that we had to hire people from Stanford to come and work on it. And
What about lessons you learned in terms of leadership or running or having a research-intensive part of your organizations?
Well, one of the lessons that I learned was evidenced by when I saw this, and I realized that the difficulty we were going to have. And unfortunately, the lab leaders, particularly in CSL, did not encourage people to go into the product development side of Xerox. And they sort of thought we could throw the stuff over the wall, it would get picked up and built. That's not the way we run Adobe. When people do research, they go all the way until the product ships. And then they can go back into research and come up with another idea. But that is a critical thing, and I think it's something that's very important.
You know, for me, Bob Taylor was an extraordinary, impactful figure, I suspect, for those of you who worked with him, because of his management style, which I should say was sort of unique. And his advocacy for his people and his fighting for principle, his product judgment, the way he dealt with Xerox Corporate all had all sorts of impacts on me as a leader. And before his untimely death, I told him that he had had an enormous impact, not just on me, but on many, many people as a leader. Ultimately, leading people of the kind that PARC had and has is not for normal managers. It's for people who sort of get it. They have to understand. You say, well, you know, what's your schedule? Well, we don't really know. Well, how long will it take? Well, we don't really know. Well, how expensive is it? Well, we don't really know. Well, is it good? Well, if it isn't incredible, you should fire us. Now, let us get back to work.
These are some questions from the audience. What do you think is the future of industrial research labs?
Well, gee, the reason we're giving this big tax cut to corporations is so that they spend more money on things like that. Not going to happen, by the way. I think industrial labs are, well, I just don't see them as having the kind of impact that PARC had or IBM Research. I'm not aware of the impact that they're having today. Certainly in pharmaceuticals and things of that kind, it is tremendous impact. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, the new model is much more integrated in the product cycle. And I think the pure researcher on the Hill is going to be less a percentage of the activity and much more integrated into the pipeline. If you take a look at AI and machine learning, which is sort of the equivalent of PARC 40 years later, right? Many of the advancements are now occurring in corporations who are busy working directly with industrial labs and universities in new and novel ways. And people forget that in pharmaceuticals, for example, much of the work is either done by startups, which they acquire, or done by joint projects they have with universities. So I think at the end of the day, the greatest resource in America today are the universities, sort of new generation of incredible talent, far even more talented than my generation, who can move so quickly now. And figuring out a way to get them integrated with your product cycle is a key deliverable for every business. I should list, I put together with some of you guys' help, a list of the spin-outs from PARC, just so you hear their names. 3Com, right? We forget 3Com, a whole industry around networking. Adobe, of course, we have its genius founder here. Aurora Systems, SuperPaint, Content Guard, right? Licensing for extensible markup language. Document, right? Acquired by EMC. Grid Systems, right? Which is going to be a very interesting piece of computer hardware. We Google occupy their building at the moment. Metaphor, acquired by IBM. MetaWave, Placeware, also acquired by Microsoft. Power Cloud Systems, using PARC IP that was developed here very recently. PowerSet, also acquired by Microsoft. They really like us for some reason here. Spectra Diode Labs, Synaptics Communications, remember them? And VLSI Technologies. If VLSI Technologies had not spun out in the way that it did, you would not have the chips in everything you use today. That's how profound this organization is.
It's quite amazing.
Oh, I forgot. Interval. I probably forgot a few others.
Yeah, does anyone have anything to add to that list, actually? Yeah. Comag.
Comag. Microlytics, okay. Park Place, yes, I remember. Pix, okay. Apple. Apple and Microsoft. Well, Microsoft's primary revenue and profits come from a product that was originally Bravo, which I was privileged to use when I was here.
Right.
Here's an interesting question. Was there any vision back then regarding digital photography? I mean, at PARC. Is that something you guys were taking on?
No. I'm not aware of us being involved in it at all. People, in general, the United States was very resistant to digital photography, primarily because of Kodak, who didn't believe that those little yellow job boxes would ever go away.
Digital photography was developed.
Sorry?
Digital photography was developed.
Yeah.
Another question we have here is, can you share more about Xerox executives' reactions to the California appearance and lifestyles of researchers as observed at Boca? And I'm going to make that a little bigger. Like, can you talk a little bit about kind of what was distinctively Northern California about PARC?
So you show up eating sprouts in shorts. They're wearing suits with short hair. Is that how it went?
We had to put a rule in that you had to wear shoes here.
I think that pretty well summarizes the answer to that question.
The basement across the street smelled funny at night.
Oh, yeah, I wonder why.
What technology or features from the early PARC days do you wish you could see implemented and utilized today? Is there anything that just hasn't made its way out?
Oh, boy. Anybody here think of anything? That's a great question, but I think that pretty much everything got embodied one way or another. Huh?
Remote meetings are still a mess.
Well, I would actually
question is about remote meetings.
I would actually say the Laurel mail client. There were features in Laurel that I loved, which we still can't get, and maybe I love them because the computers are so slow. One of the things that you forget is how incredibly slow these CPUs and memories were when Sun Microsystems happened, which was about that period in the early 80s. The key achievement was a single megahertz processor. So we forget how slow the original PCs and so forth. So you can imagine stuff that the researchers here at Chuck Geschke would have been even slower just because of the nature of the technology. Keyset, virtual keyboards.
Here's another question. Can you talk about another day or days, or let's call it moments, that really stand out for you both from your time at PARC?
These are hard questions.
So I remember John Schock was sent off for a year to work for the president of Xerox, which was at the time was to get some new ideas into Xerox. And so we had dealers every Thursday or something in the afternoon, and he came back and gave his report. And the most notable part about his report was his report on the electrical lighting system of the building, because the power went out at 5 p.m. and he wanted to work late. And so he eventually convinced the guard to give him a lamp, but then he discovered that the air conditioning went off at 6 p.m. And he painted a picture of a corporate world of the 1970s, which we all know was true, which was so antithetical to the world that we collectively had built here. Now today, the good news is at Stanford, Connecticut, that doesn't happen anymore. But we forget how much the society has changed. Remember, it was all men, they were all in suits. They were typically not very technical, right, in a sense that our leaders are technical today in many of these industries. And people like the group here were treated as, oh, okay, whatever. Whereas now people understand the issues of innovation, they understand crossing the chasm, and all those. And so the next generation of business leaders who have gone to business school and have been taught all this will behave very differently.
Do you have anything to add to that, Chuck?
No, I don't think so, although one thing I recall very clearly is John Schock coming and describing what he had done by turning loose this demon on the network and taking over all of the altos. He was way ahead of his time.
Well, this is actually the end of the questions that were handed to me. So we're right at 6 o'clock, which is a good accomplishment. My understanding, Tolga, is that you had something else you wanted to say?
It's really to close up the session. So one of the things